IoT Unplugged, where we talk to industry leaders, innovators, and major players in the Internet of Things, bringing you the best and latest insights. Tune in to learn more. In this episode, I'm talking to David Earle, CEO of Eseye, about trends and technologies in the IoT landscape, as we cover ground from eSIM technology to connectivity challenges and hurdles restricting wider adoption of IoT. Thanks for joining me here today, Nick. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So am I, Caitlin. Good to see you.
To start us off, can you quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Nick Earle. I'm the CEO of Eseye. Lots of people don't know how to spell our name, so I'm going to spell it Eseye, or pronounce it. Yeah, the best one, excuse me, the best one I've seen, well, the most common one is Eseye, which is good. And the best one was when I was in France once, somebody said, Eseye, which is French for to try. So he says, you're like Avis, you try harder. And so I said, yes, that's exactly what we call it. But yeah, CEO of Eseye, and we're an IoT company, global IoT company, with many million devices under management and customers all over the world. And we're based in Guildford in Surrey.
Great. Well, thank you for that introduction, Nick. To start our conversation off, or to frame our conversation today, we're going to be discussing some of the prevalent trends and technologies that we're seeing in the IoT industry. So what major trends and technologies have you seen that have been particularly significant this year?
I always think that when you talk about trends, you've really got to look to the data, because opinion is one thing, but data is much better. And to that point, we do an annual survey of people who are in the IoT business, end user customers. And what makes our survey different, we believe, to other people's surveys is that we actually interview people, first of all, enterprises. We interview them around the world, principally the US and the UK, but not exclusively. But we start off from a different premise to a lot of the analyst surveys, in that we say we want to interview people who have implemented an IoT project, and we particularly want to interview people who have had problems. And so we actually look for the reasons why IoT didn't work. So it's kind of upside down to a lot of surveys, which over the past 10, 15 years have been really awful. I mean, I often tell the story. I was in Cisco for many years, but in 2010, we published a survey, said 50 billion things would be connected by 2020. And when we got to 2020, the 50 billion actually was 11 billion. And I call it, one of the biggest misses in IT forecasting. And how on earth did we, only get to roughly 20%? And it's the Pareto rule. It's the fact that, 20% of the big companies only make 80% of the products, and the big global projects hadn't happened, and still haven't to a great extent. There's a lot of regional. There's a lot of people putting local MNO SIMs in and doing regional IoT, which is great, and even multi-IMSI, maybe 2 or 3 operators bolted together. But when you look at a true global, the promise of IoT, a single SKU that you can manufacture once with technology on the board, sealed unit, ship it anywhere in the world, in any location where there's cellular signal. In the future, it will be satellite, but for the moment, anywhere where there is a cellular signal, and to guarantee 100% connectivity, that is what will be needed for the large companies, the 80%, to say, I'm going to embrace IoT. And we haven't done it so far. And so the surveys that we do look at the data and where people had the problems, and maybe that's what we can talk about, because we've just recently redone that survey and published it on our website.
Well, why don't you go into some of the problems?
Yeah, so just the raw data, 1,500 companies, medium to large. And when we asked them in retrospect, what sort of connectivity were you getting? If you want a global SKU, 100% connectivity, what are you actually getting? And really, the survey is really, I think, a badge of shame for the industry. 90, less than 1% of people in the survey said that they were getting more than 98% connectivity on average across their global estate. Now, you can measure connectivity a different way, but broadly, it's the fact that they believe that their devices are connected when they need them, more than 98% of the time. So basically, ubiquitous connectivity. And actually, the weird thing is that number has actually gone down from the previous year. It's getting worse. So what we then do is, and there's two or three big findings. That was the first one. And on that particular one, the basic problem is when we ask them why, what they essentially said is, well, I can't buy a single SIM, be it an eSIM or from an MVNO or an MNO. I can't buy a single SIM that actually gives me global ubiquitous constant connectivity. Now, we can talk about the technical reasons why that is, but one of the things that I firmly believe in and we promote here at Eseye a lot is that the issue is actually, it starts off with a structural issue in the industry. Now, we get to my stage in the career, you have the benefit of being able to look back over many, many trends. I've seen a lot of proprietary technology give way to open interoperability technology based on a common standard. And almost every technology that we have today started off proprietary, and user demand forced the emergence of a common standard and the ability to interoperate. When I was at Cisco, that was called the IP standard. My first mobile phone when I was at HP, I could only phone you, let's say, if you also had a Vodafone SIM in it. But if you had somebody else's SIM, phones couldn't even talk to each other across networks. And where we are now with IoT is that the 98% of the connections in the world are controlled by the major operators. And they have had the same business model for 40 years, which is a proprietary SIM, which locks you into to localize the connection via their IMSI, International Mobile Subscriber Identity, and then they choose the roaming agreements. But there are over 800 operators and not average 3-4 per country. And it's a mathematical thing of a big Venn diagram. No one person is big enough to have a roaming agreement with everybody else. And even if they did, roaming agreements are like thin ice. They get broken all the time because of financial disputes. And 24 hours notice, this network is not available. Or a regulator suddenly decides to protect the hometown hero and say, oh, no permanent roaming in our country. And so when you look at it, if you're going to create a product as a large enterprise and say, I want it out there for 10 years, which is about average, meters 15, sometimes medical devices 2 or 3. If you want it out there for 8 to 10 years, you can't have a situation where at any one time connectivity can be turned off and there's nothing you can do about it. So my point being is that there's you cannot make ubiquitous global connectivity from a structure of 800 independent silos. I don't care how much money you've got, and there's lots of very large operators have thrown a lot of money at this. Now, if you add it to the fact that the data prices are coming down, then you actually get financial pressure on the market. Give you a little data point. When I joined SI 6 years ago, the cost of a gigabyte of data was about £1.10p, £1.20 best price. Today, people will quote you 10p for a gig. So that's broadly Moore's law. We all know what Moore's law is. So what you have is a structure which is like a house of cards. It looks good, but it can fall at short notice. And then you have a financial problem where everyone's making less and less money because the amount of data devices are absorbing is not following Moore's law in the other direction. And then what you have is roaming. There's good news at the end of all of this, but it's important to understand the structure of the industry because that actually is what defines disruptive opportunity. Roaming is that if say you're an operator and I localize onto you and I'm paying £1 per device per month, you're getting £1. If you then pass that data to another operator and you roam onto their network via your SIM, you only pass on average 20 pence, so 20%. So the recipient of roaming only gets 20% of a declining number because the price of the data is declining. You put all those things together, it's pretty clear that that system can't last. And what you're seeing back to the survey is that people are saying, I can't rely on any infrastructure to do, or any one operator or a certain class of MVNOs to actually give me global connectivity. Now, in our case, if just briefly, and the purpose here isn't to advertise Eseye, but just to say we actually do. For instance, I talk about our customers. We do all of Amazon, we do Shell, we do BP, we do Coca-Cola. Our customers all have 100% connectivity, and we actually contract for that. So the way we do it is different. Our founders, still in the business, by the way, created Zigbee, so they're very technical. So Zigbee's in 5 billion devices, and it is global ubiquitous connectivity from the board. Took a very smart decision very early on that said the industry is structurally flawed. This was before EUICC or SGP 32 or whatever, but the industry is structurally flawed. And if you do want to go where the money is, the big customers, they will want SKU because the money's in the back end saving. It's in the simpler manufacturing, simpler supply chain, simpler distribution, simpler installation. That's the ROI for IoT. The ROI is not in the marketing data. That's a bonus. It's in the back end cost reduction, which means you need single product SKU. So in order to do that, the architecture of the IoT industry has to fundamentally change in two ways. It has to be based on something more akin to the Star Alliance in the airline industry. And the switch has to be agnostic and abstracted. So if you're okay, I'll just quickly describe what I mean by both of those. So what do I mean by the Star Alliance? I think it was 1997, Star Alliance was formed. And what happened up to that point, you couldn't buy an airline ticket and fly on more than one airline. It sounds crazy, but it's around the same time. You couldn't do it. Yeah, you had to if you wanted to, do a around the world trip. You had to buy separate tickets. You had to pay. You had different tracking numbers. You couldn't share the gates. I mean, it was proprietary style pipes. And eventually, somebody said, "This is crazy," and some big airlines said, "Look, why don't we do sharing? We'll have a common platform." And we have the system we have today, and Star Alliance is now, everybody knows that you can book a ticket by a Star Alliance, and actually you have this massive choice. And essentially that business model, although it's airlines, is what's needed for IoT. So in our case, we have 16 interconnects. Think of that as airlines. 16 interconnects with 16 operators, and we can not only roam across all of their networks, which makes for about just under 800 roaming agreements, so lots of choice, lots of paths to every network. But what we can do is our switch can localize the connection if needed. So our switch is either roaming or localization. Now that technically is a very difficult thing to do, and you need to have a certain type of interconnect, probably for another podcast. But the moment you've got federated orchestration of both roaming and localization enabled through the switch, then the switch becomes abstracted and agnostic, and the power moves to the switch. So what we do is we have that, and if you took Amazon, I've got my own podcast series, IoT Leaders, and we recently did one with Amazon who talking about how they are doing global ubiquitous connectivity for their what they call Amazon Key, which is the ability for the Amazon Prime driver to gain secure access to any door which has a buzzer on. It could be a gate, it could be what the Americans call a condominium apartment. And they're trying to make it an industry standard, so FedEx, UPS, and everybody else can use the same system. I joked with the guy, a typical Amazon project, you're trying to own every door in the world. But in order to do that, you need 100% connectivity, and that means the switch has to be completely agnostic to the underlying operator. and completely agnostic as to whether you roam or localize, and you blend everything else, single invoice, single pane of glass, single set of APIs, etc., etc. So, apologies for the long overview, but I'm a great believer, and I've seen a lot of stuff in my career. This isn't just about the standard or any technology, and the engineering is important, but you've got to have an architectural model that encourages interoperability and agnosticity. And if you can solve that problem, that's when you get the inflection point of adoption. And that came out from the survey.
So there were quite a few things you said in there, Nick, that I want to pick apart a little bit more. And to kind of summarize what you said in addressing the fundamental architecture, you said needs to be changed. Also, something you kind of alluded to, which I thought was interesting, is sometimes it's difficult to know what technology to invest in, particularly if it's emerging technology in its early days. And that the survey gave you a good idea of the hurdles to IoT adoption. I guess my question to you, based on everything that you've said, is there anything else that needs to be changed or needs to be addressed to make sure that this statistic your survey gave about connectivity stops being so low and actually goes to the point where it needs to be?
Yes, there is, and I mentioned earlier there were a couple of big findings. There's a lot of findings in the report. I say it's on our website, but there's a couple of big findings. That was the first one, which we think reinforces the architectural approach. The second one is actually to do with that switch itself. So again, a little bit of a history looking back. When the industry, with the mobile network operators, all have their own switch, the SMSR as it's called, and so the switch is resident at the operator level. Over the last 5-6 years, there's been a high growth in a lot of MVNOs. We're an MVNO, we're a different type of MVNO, as I said, but we're an MVNO. And essentially, the MVNO sits above a collection of operators and offers agnostic choice. But the key thing architecturally is the switch moves up a layer. So the switch, the SMSR, the SMDP, the list of the IMSIs, etc. The switch is resident within the CMP, the connectivity management platform of the MVNO. Now, we believe that the ultimate destination of the switch is actually one layer above, and this did come out in the survey. I'll talk about that, which is the switch has to be device resident. In other words, edge computing, or put simplistically, the device has to choose its own connectivity. Now, this was borne out by the survey, which is that when we said to people, okay, so you're not getting connectivity, which part of the project was technically the most difficult? And I think something like 60% of people, which is about the same percentage as last year, said, I completely underestimated the importance of the device in choosing the connectivity. What that means is firmware expertise. Most of us still think that connectivity is sort of like this. I mean, this connects. I can go everywhere. What's the problem? There's millions and millions of dollars have been put into the firmware optimization and tightly coupled hardware and software on that device. And there are only about 6 or 7 models of cell phones in the world. Every IoT product is different. And when you do hop across networks, you're hopping across different ways of interconnecting. You have the push standard SGP02, where an IMSI is pushed into the device. You have the new pull standard SGP32, where the device pulls the IMSI. You have the consumer standard, which is how your phone and your Apple Watch works, SGP22. And so the customers, the users are saying, I don't want to have a dog in this fight. I just want to be able to put something in my device and it works. I don't have firmware engineers. I'm not tracking all the different changes to the GSMA standards. So the answer to the question is that the biggest inhibitor on connectivity is actually the device. And therefore it has to be, IoT projects have to be provided as a fully managed service, where the definition of a managed service includes the device optimization. So in our case, what we do is every project we've done, and we have about 800 customers. Every project we've done, we have optimized the firmware in that device. Now, a lot of people say, "Oh, well, nobody else tells me I need to do that," and then we go back to the survey and say, "Yeah, but look at the data on success." So we have firmware engineers, we have a hardware group, we optimize the firmware, and what we've done, we realize that that's not scalable, because although it solves the problem, our customers all get 100% connectivity, and we'll stand up and talk about that, and that's what my podcasts are all about. But it's not scalable. So the next piece of the story is that what we've now done, and we released it about a year ago, is that we've said actually the switch should be resident in the device. So we've introduced something called Smart Connect. But essentially what Smart Connect is pre-packaged firmware that can go into the device, which optimizes the firm. It sits above the device's existing firmware, and it optimizes the instructions that go into the microprocessor to ensure that all these choices about if connecting to Verizon, the firmware works this way. If connected to AT&T, using a US example, the different architectures, so the firmware has to work this way. If roaming, then this. If localizing, then this. There's tons of these corner cases. But that plug-in firmware, which isn't heavy on the device, then essentially acts as the switch and the firmware optimization for the device, which means when people are making devices, they actually, if they put Smart Connect in, then Smart Connect will actually work almost like the old client-server model, in that it'll talk to the CMP, so the device management at the server level, or the cloud, as we now call it, and it will also have intelligence in the device. And that combination of the two things talking together will be able to then do optimization on things that we can't do today, like, for example, choosing your MNO by signal strength. There are 4 signals around me, say. I want to connect my device. Maybe I don't want to just connect on what the MVNO does because of their financial arrangement. Maybe I want to connect based on who's got the lowest latency or who's got the highest signal strength. And the next device, which might be 10 yards away, might want to make a different choice. So what you get is long-tail optimization or personalization of connectivity based on what's happening around the device. So we believe that if you really truly want to optimize connectivity, and by the way, I talked about satellite. If satellite, then you need to load the firmware to communicate with satellite, because it's different to communicate with cellular. That's already in your iPhone, but it's not in your IoT device. So when you get to multi-RAT, the need for device intelligence and device processing gets bigger and bigger. And we don't want the problem to get bigger and bigger of people having to suddenly design hardware, which we thought we'd wave goodbye to with cloud. So what we've done is release this plugin. It's kind of like Twilio. When iPhones first released, millions of developers developed apps, but they didn't know how to do omni-channel communication in the device. So Twilio released a library of APIs to be able to do text, video, chat, et cetera, in your app. Twilio built the whole business around that. So it's kind of like Twilio for IoT. And so the next big thing that we have to solve is that we have to make the device design easier. First of all, you have to do it. It's the number one reason why you fail. If you don't, but even if you do it, we have to make it scalable through software, which is what we've released with Smart Connect. And that's very much illustrated in the survey, which says the number one reason in retrospect why people failed was the device optimization.
And earlier you gave the example when you bought a SIM card, you could only use that specific SIM card on a phone. So I think it kind of links back to this messaging around how when these common challenges are acknowledged and work goes towards addressing them, things then evolve to a point where now phones are interoperable.
And that's happening right now. I'll tell you exactly when that was. I was working for HP in Manchester at the time. I was so excited when the first mobile phones were handed out to the sales force. It was a brick. You got a shoulder strap with it, by the way, because the battery was so heavy. But it was cool. And then they appeared in cars, which was even cooler. But essentially, it was just one network to one network. So to your point about what's happening now which is actually probably the third big point, is that I often get asked the question. We do a predictions report on what's going to happen in the next 12 months, and it's the number one downloaded piece of collateral off our website. And the predictions for 2025 are that actually now that the standards are there, I've quoted a lot of them. There's also the eSIM and there's also EUICC. What's happening is it is now possible to buy global ubiquitous connectivity, which means that there's tremendous pressure on MNOs, because if MNOs don't offer it because they are taking their connectivity to market, it's a one-to-many topology. If they don't offer it, their customers will say, well, my next project, I'll go with someone who does offer it. So a lot of the RFPs that we've responded to, it never crossed their mind to send it to an MNO. So this is extremely disruptive for the MNOs, who control 98% of the world's connectivity. So what you're now seeing is the MNOs are putting a new connectivity management platform in place above their existing ones in order to be able to offer this. So in terms of topology, I said one to many, one MNO, too many customers, one to many. What MNOs now want is many to one to many. So that means many operators bundled together or put into a managed SaaS service, like the Star Alliance concept, through them, so they can control the customer, they can do the invoicing to many customers. So the topology for IoT architecture in the industry is now changing to many to one to many. And so, for example, that means that MNOs are now white labeling, in our case, our solution. So our first one was TELUS in Canada, and the one we announced last year was MTN, where MTN, the biggest operator in Africa, are now using our platform for all of their IoT business, install base and new business across 18 countries, because we can deliver them 100% connectivity in Africa. They're putting it on top of what they've got. As TELUS have done, they've put it on top of Cisco Jasper. And we absolutely predict that this is going to accelerate, because for the operators, if they don't do it, they're just left with managing a declining install base. So this is disruption. And by the way, open standards and interoperability are always the precursor to disruption. So now, for us at least, what we are seeing is a whole new opportunity to license our platform as a pay-as-you-use OpEx model, not a build your own or not a resident behind their firewall model, where they put it above their existing offers. It's interconnects. We call it a platform of platforms, but essentially we're enabling the operators to provide this service, and we believe absolutely that we shouldn't compete with the operators, that success is to enable them. But in order to enable them, you have got to help them solve the device, and you've got to have the interconnects. You've got to already have the Star Alliance, because it's very hard for them to negotiate it as one operator, and because it's kind of like a new form of roaming, but it's roaming based on federated rules-based orchestration of localization. It's a lot of big words there, but hopefully I've explained them. So roaming is based on temporary roaming and fragility, but it's been there for 40 years. What now is emerging is a new model for IoT roaming, which is based on reciprocal localization, almost like a futures exchange. I'd use a lot of analogies, but I find that people say it does make sense when you actually look at it. There's nothing unique about business models in IoT. So, for instance, if you wanted to buy sugar, another crazy analogy, airlines and sugar. You wanted to buy sugar, what you do is you can buy futures, or pork bellies, sugar, copper, whatever. You actually say, I want guaranteed supply over a period of years, and I want it a certain quality and at a certain price. And you go to an independent third party and you buy that. So you buy a futures contract. What we see happening now is operators then start to say, well, for the first time, I actually will. I know you're my competitor, but I want to localize onto you, not just roam. And I know you're going to say to me, well, I want to localize onto you, onto me. So why don't we have like a futures exchange model whereby it's not generic because the IoT traffic today gets lost. The localization gets lost in amongst the consumer traffic, and that's why people don't trust it. And they say, no, the balance of trade's wrong. I don't trust it. Kill roaming. Bang. You know, literally 2 to 3 hours notice, roaming arrangements get killed. People don't realize that, but we monitor it, of course, and they do. But this one says, no, no, no. I want to localize my customer, Megacorp, onto your network because they want 100% coverage in this country. And I'll let you localize one of your customers onto mine, and we'll do a sort of futures contract between the two of us to guarantee permanency of connectivity. And so I believe, and many people believe, and a lot of people in the operators believe, that roaming won't go away, but it's clearly fragile. And that's why you see the imposition of access fees, which is a tax to make up for the drop in the price because of the 20%. But what's going to happen is a new model of almost like account-specific agreements through a common switch, which will act as the way of measuring whether people are adhering to the agreement. So you can't separate the IoT traffic from consumer today, but if it goes through a common platform with a common switch, then in our case, we can be the independent arbiter that makes sure that everyone is playing by the rules. So it's a big thought, but it's more than a thought. It's a big thing. A lot of people in the industry talking about it, and it won't immediately happen, but I do believe that will become the model. I also believe we're clearly seeing there's a ton of RFPs from operators for eSIM global platforms now, so it's definitely happening. And all of these things, if you boil them all down, and with the data from the survey and everything, says, it, as the song goes, it's about damn time. Didn't want to quote Lizzo in a podcast, but it is about damn time because it's, we've been saying that we want ubiquitous connectivity, and these stats are appalling. And ultimately, the customer's purchasing power will force interoperability, which means change. And these proprietary silos have to give away to open interoperable platforms. So I think that's what's going on. And I think that there's a lot of evidence to support this. It is difficult. There's a lot of claims and counterclaims, but I think it's inevitable, especially given that the underlying model that is dominant today is financially stressed, which is why you see operators either saying they're not going to do IoT or they're not going to do the lower end of IoT, like narrowband. There's been several announcements of operators saying, 2-3 years ago, narrowband was the savior, right? Now there's a bunch of operators saying, I'm not doing it anymore. It's not a technical problem. It's the fact you're getting 20% of a tiny number. And it's just not worth it because your servers and your software licenses and your people are all going, it's all going up in price, and you're getting 20% of a number that's declined 10x over 6 years and will carry on. So clearly everything's shaking. And if it was business school, you say, what do you think is going to happen next? We believe the emergence of a agnostic, open, interoperable platform that federates the operators and enables them to offer the many to one-to-many solution. And that's a huge opportunity for a lot of companies, not just us, but it's certainly something that keeps us focused every day. And I think the data is so bad that it's the proof as to why users, customers, enterprises are frustrated and are demanding a new model. So there's a lot of pieces to this that all point in the same direction. And I think we spend a lot of time in IoT talking about a lot of things, but from a big picture of where it's going, For us, that seems to be the big trend here.
And it goes to show the influence, as you used the word purchasing power, the influence of customers' purchasing power when they get fed up and say, this isn't something I'm going to be doing.
Yeah, I'll tell you a little story on that. One of my roles I had, I said I mentioned Cisco, and I ended up I did a bunch of roles. Anyway, one of the roles I was given, I was asked to help drive the cloud program for Cisco. Sounds very grand, but it was a global role. And one of the things that Cisco did, and they will talk openly about it now, is they were measuring their market share. John Chambers, legendary CEO, measuring the market share of their products, and they were saying, well, our routers or routers, as they call it, the routers and the switches and whatever, they all have 72%, 73% market share. So what's the problem? And the problem was that you're measuring the past. The more relevant statistic in terms of future survival is what percentage of new sales are going on that technology. If you measured it that way around, it's like 20%, because 80% was going to cloud, because cloud represented freedom from the data center. You don't need to buy hardware, you rent the service, as we now know. So it's very hard for people when they look at their business to actually see disruption. Disruption is inherently invisible until it's too late. Because often you're looking back and you're measuring things and you're saying, well, we still have a multi-billion-dollar business. I'm still top right in Gartner's Magic Quadrant. But actually what's happening is the new projects are gradually looking at new models. And so having seeing the disruption and then moving is key. And although if you'd have interviewed me 3-4 years ago, I like to think I would have said the same thing. Certainly, we were pumping out these messages because of the architecture. I do believe now these things have come together with the standards, the eSIM, which is itself agnostic, the EUICC standard, the SGP 3222, which to your earlier point has to be provided as a continuum, so it shouldn't be either or. It should be a service which, if 22 is right, the CMP will push the IMSI into the device. If 32 is right, then the device will pull the IMSI. But most importantly, everything, all those things around, for instance, how do you change the APN, which when people do slick demos, they don't show you. But you've got to look at the APN. What about the APIs? What about the contracts? What about the billing? What about notifying operator A that you're no longer connected to them, you're now connected to operator B? All of that has to be handled by a managed service provider. Otherwise, you get in trouble. In fact, you go backwards. But we'll solve that as an industry. And what's now happening is the purchasing power, to your point. When Amazon say, this is the way I'm going to do all my IoT, we do all of Shell's EV globally. And it's a single SKU sealed unit. And when Shell say that's the way I'm going to do it, BP, all of Coca-Cola's vending, the Costa Coffee, we all know, they're all, that's all our stuff. Single product SKU, single vending machine anywhere in the world, etc. When the 80%, the 20% of the companies that own 80%, build and own and sell 80% of the products, when those projects start to go this model, and we've already done it in cars, but that's a special case. Now we're talking industrial. Then suddenly, that's when adoption occurs, and I do believe that that's what's happening right now, and it's good for customers, and it will accelerate adoption, and it's good for everybody. It's not that it's radical. Actually, it kind of asks you, why has it taken so long? Because everything else seems to have become interoperable. Back to my crazy Lizzo quote. Everything else is, why has it taken 40 years for this to happen? Another conversation. But it is inevitable. It is happening. It will play out slowly, but it's accelerating. And it's very exciting. I've got to give a shout out to our founders who this seems obvious now to most people, but 16 years ago, coming up for 17 actually, to sit down and say and draw a picture on a whiteboard that says this is the only way it's going to work is pretty impressive. And so they always thought it was the case, but it's definitely happening now, and there'll be lots of examples in 2025 that reinforce this.
Lots to look forward to, certainly. So, with everything that we've spoken about, Nick, I'm aware that we've covered a lot of ground looking at the IoT landscape, looking at this point you made about the architecture changing. What would be your key takeaways?
Well, first of all, I think 2025 will be a good year for the industry because change is happening. I think the players' landscape will change because transitions are fantastic, but transitions are an opportunity and a threat to people. I think that there are some new models that when the device chooses the intelligence, there are whole new models that will emerge, and one of which is security and trust get blended together. And so there's no way we're going to be able to cover this briefly, but just to put it out there as a teaser, again, I did a podcast on this, but if you think about you want security is often implemented a lot of layers above the device, and we're just doing a sort of secure enclave for the SIM in the device. But what you actually want is the ability to have the security application resident within the device, and for instance, do public-private key encryption of the data, so that when it arrives in the cloud, you can do private public key encryption, do it the other way around, and prove that the data hasn't been interfered with on the pipe or the pipes. It's kind of like blockchain, but applied to IoT in a trust model. The moment you can trust the provenance of the data, the auditability of the data, then you actually then create whole new business models. So, for example, we do a lot in emerging markets. I talked about Africa, and a lot of the products in emerging markets are using solar because there's no electricity grid. Well, people trade carbon credits, and the price of a carbon credit for getting rid of a kilogram of carbon-based fuel varies based on the quality and the trust you have in the data. It can vary hugely. It can go from $2 to $50, depending on how much can you trust the data, the quality. Well, if you can actually enable that trust model end to end, you're actually now creating a new economic model for emerging markets, whereby you can actually be paid for using the device because you're using solar. And there are firms out there wanting to do this and create carbon credits exchanges where you have full auditability and traceability of the data, like you do in the stock exchange. And I'm not talking crypto. I'm talking the normal monetary system, but device intelligence enables whole new opportunities, like completely agnostic connectivity. Cellular is only 13% of connectivity. Only, and satellite, of course, is coming in very, very rapidly. Starlink and others, but there's also LoRa. There's everything, multi-rat. There's Halo, which will be able to get through brick walls. I mean, so what you actually want is not just ubiquitous connectivity. You want ubiquitous radio access. So if the switch was completely agnostic to the radio access type, as well as the source of that radio network, then actually you could then start to do some very, very interesting models, which today are separate silos. And you can bring together business and consumer in the home. And you can have devices that, like we're just starting to see them today, like an EV charger, or take that Costa Coffee machine that we do, if it's in a BP garage. If the garage Wi-Fi is available, then use that. If not, choose the network. Simple example. But the EV charger on the side of your garage say it's outside your garage on the wall. If your home network is available and the signal is strong enough, use that because it's free. If not, use cellular. Choose cellular. Think of that applied to all forms of connectivity in every device, in a chip on the device, with a small bit of firmware that can also sit in the processor of the device. So suddenly every device then becomes ubiquitous connectivity, but not just cellular, any form of connectivity. Now, when you think about the adoption of every product becomes a service, which is where we're going, the capex to opex model. Then, if you enable any form of connectivity to any device from anybody in a way that you can trust the data and you can measure it and et cetera, you will see an explosion of take up. And so I think the one area to finish on, I would say, is that we've talked about edge computing. 80% of applications and data will be stored at the edge. But I don't think we talked enough about edge IoT and what it means. And this is where AI comes in, because then you can use advanced AI to make all of those choices. All of those choices between what type of access type, all of those choices, what type of provider, what granularity can you get on the how fast can you do it, how quickly can you change. The guy, when he did the Amazon podcast for us, talked about optimizing every door in the world so it chose the best connectivity for that door. And so I think that then you start to get software-based models, which actually will totally transform the value proposition that can be delivered through a device. And that's a big subject, and I've got time to cover today. Maybe it's a future subject, but I think that's the big area that we're going to be talking about going forward, is the role of the device, which has been, we've come at it from the other end, the role of the operator, the role of the MVNO. I think increasingly going forward, we'll talk about the role of the device in federating the orchestration of all of the other layers.
We've certainly provided a lot of food for thought, Nick, and I do hope people will come away with things to chew on. So thank you for speaking to me and for sharing your insights here at IoT Unplugged.
Great to speak to you. Enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
IoT Unplugged.